Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. Alex Murdaugh. The man's name even makes him sound guilty because it sounds like murder. But while his case is disgusting, it's certainly not unique. I'm going to give this one the once-over for the people who are not familiar with it, but rather than be shocked at anything you hear, instead you'll probably be bored with how this case is so similar to the other crime reports I've posted. Alex Murdaugh comes from old Southern Democrats' money, or at the very least, old Southern Democrat power and influence. That means that his family were part of what would come out of antebellum slavery to become eventually the Dixiecrats, old South good old boys who are responsible for that region of the country being the most backwards in America. His family's been in the legal profession in South Carolina for generations. Alex's great-grandfather established the family's law firm in 1910. Its name was Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Ellsroth, and Dietrich. Talk about truth in advertising. What do the initials of that law firm spell? Pimped, which if you do business with them is exactly what you'll be. Murdaugh and his family lived on a sprawling complex that sat on a 1,700-acre property. His family, or rather the patriarchs of the family, have been prominent in South Carolina legal circles for a very, very long time. Murdaugh's father, his grandfather, and great-grandfather all held the position of Solicitor of the 14th Judicial District. It's an elected position, but as you would expect under white supremacy, these guys get to hand down elected positions from one family member to the next, from father to son, as if it was a family heirloom. Because it is. White power makes sure that these things are frozen in place and held for themselves. Being Solicitor of the 14th Judicial District meant that his fathers were able to oversee trials throughout the area. Very helpful if you want to make sure that you can get away with crime. Holding political office for so long meant that the Murdaughs were plugged into power at the local and state levels. America has given the Alex Murdaughs everything, and given it to them not because they worked for it, but precisely because they didn't work for it. As Abraham Lincoln put it, this country assigns the superior position to people like Alex Murdaugh, not based on his legal background or family tradition of being professional shysters, but simply because of white privilege. If there's anyone who has absolutely no excuse for not being set, it's him. Well, he's the subject of this crime report, so you know he managed to take that sure thing and mess it up. Alex Murdaugh's fall from grace took far longer than you may be aware of, and while the only thing people have talked about has been the murders of his wife and one of his sons, his descent into depravity began long before he killed his spouse and child. February 2nd, 2018. 57-year-old Gloria Satterfield worked at the Murdaugh estate as a housekeeper and nanny for 25 years. Gloria reportedly had been climbing some stairs at the Murdaugh home when she fell backwards and suffered several injuries in her fall. Immediately after she fell, Alex Murdaugh rushed to the scene, getting there before even the paramedics could, and he began telling everyone that Miss Satterfield had briefly regained consciousness, and that she had told him that she had tripped over some family dogs who had been on the stairs. Miss Satterfield was airlifted to a hospital in Charleston and hospitalized for multiple rib fractures, a pulmonary contusion, and a subdural hematoma which doctors declared to be inoperable. She was eventually put on a ventilator. While in the ICU, Gloria was still semi-conscious, and she told hospital staff that she didn't know how or why she fell, a statement that contradicts Alex Murdaugh's claims. She contracted pneumonia and suffered a heart attack while at the hospital, leaving her in a coma. Her family elected to take her off of life support, and she was then moved to hospice where she died on February 26, 2018. Her death would be ruled of natural causes, even though there was never an autopsy performed. What nobody knew, though, was that a month before Miss Satterfield's death, Alex Murdaugh had taken out a big commercial insurance policy with Nautilus Insurance. Murdaugh had defrauded Miss Satterfield's two sons by telling them that he wanted to help them get compensation for their mother's tragic death. Alex Murdaugh suggested to Satterfield's sons that they should sue his insurance companies, and that he would admit fault so that they could easily get a large settlement. Murdaugh had already been telling multiple people in Hampton County that he was liable for Gloria's fall and death. This was an admission against interest that practically guaranteed that there was no way for the insurance companies to challenge Murdaugh's liability. As it turned out, this was all part of the plan. After Satterfield's death, Alex Murdaugh allegedly began pressuring Nautilus Insurance to settle the claim quickly, threatening to sue them for bad faith if they refused to pay the policy limits. Nautilus claimed that Murdaugh went so far as to verbally abuse the insurance adjuster who was handling the claim. Murdaugh threatened that if Nautilus refused to settle and the case wound up going to trial, he would admit liability before a jury, which would expose the insurance company to an even higher verdict. But Murdaugh wasn't working alone. According to Nautilus, he had friends helping him run this little scam. His two alleged accomplices were his lawyer, Corey Fleming, and Chad Westerdorf, a bank official at Palmetto State Bank, who Nautilus accuses of moving the money from the Satterfield heirs to Murdaugh and Fleming. Fleming allegedly was paid $600,000 in attorney fees for handling the case, and he dispersed the settlement money into a bank account that Murdaugh created under the name Forge. Remember that name, you will be seeing it again soon. Murdaugh collected the insurance settlements for the death of Gloria Satterfield, both totaling over $4 million. Neither Gloria Satterfield's sons nor any other of her family members even knew that the settlements had occurred until after they read about it in the newspaper. Gloria's siblings then wanted to know why the family hadn't gotten any money from the settlement, and why Alex Murdaugh hadn't told them that he had already cashed in on Gloria's death. February 24, 2019, a year after Gloria Satterfield's death, Alex Murdaugh would become connected to another fatal incident. Alex's youngest son, 19-year-old Paul, had taken the family boat out for a sail. He also had some friends on the boat. Paul was drunk and crashed the boat into a bridge. Several of the passengers were thrown into the water. One of them was 19-year-old Mallory Beach. Her body wouldn't be found until a week after the incident. The boat belonged to Alex Murdaugh, which exposed him to direct liability. In April 2019, he would be charged with 3 felony counts in connection with the boat crash. He pleaded not guilty, though as bad as that wasn't the legal problem that scared him the most. The real problem came when Mallory Beach's parents sued him. Murdaugh would use every means he could to stall those civil proceedings, especially the Beach family's attempts to make him reveal his own financial details. He got a big assist in this stalling tactic when the pandemic hit, which brought the courts to a crawl. But the lawsuit from the Beach family was a huge problem for him that wasn't going to go away. You're probably familiar with the old saying that trouble comes in threes? Well, for Alex Murdaugh, it came in fours. Sometime in mid to late April, 6 weeks before the double murder, Alex Murdaugh's wife, Maggie, drove to Charleston, an hour from the family's home, to meet with a divorce attorney. She was reportedly exploring her options to end their marriage as a result of having looked into the state of their marital assets. Finally, a hearing for the civil case regarding Mallory Beach's death had been scheduled for June 10, 2021. It would have helped to reveal Murdaugh's financial situation, but the hearing would never be held. And that was because June 7th was the day that this whole sordid affair came to a head. When Alex Murdaugh arrived at his law office for work that morning, the chief financial officer for the firm confronted him about $792,000 in missing funds. The first suspicions that Alex Murdaugh had been embezzling money from the firm came in May 2021 after Murdaugh and another attorney at the firm, Chris Wilson, who was also Murdaugh's best friend, had won a verdict of $5.5 million in a personal injury case. Murdaugh and Wilson each received $792,000 as their attorney fees. Now, normally the checks get written to the firm, but in this case, Murdaugh had asked Wilson to write a check to him personally. Wilson had known Murdaugh for 30 years and felt that there was no reason to mistrust him, so he complied and wrote Murdaugh the check. Murdaugh would later ask Wilson to rewrite the check and make it out to the law firm this time. Murdaugh said that he would cover Wilson's expenses by wiring him the money, but Murdaugh only wired $600,000. He claimed that he didn't have enough to cover the entire $792,000. So Wilson had to use his own money to cover the remaining $192,000. But apparently this wasn't the only missing money from the firm that Murdaugh was suspected in. The firm's financial officer learned that Murdaugh was misappropriating funds and sending them to a personal account named Forge, which I told you about earlier. And the reason that he chose that name in specific is because it's very similar to a legitimate financial services company that the law firm did business with, Forge Consulting LLC. When the law firm got ready to send checks to Forge Consulting, Alex Murdaugh insisted that he be the one to hand-deliver the checks himself. Naturally, Forge Consulting never got any of these hand-delivered checks. The firm's financial officer told Murdaugh that she had reason to believe he had received the funds himself, and that he needed to prove to the firm that he didn't have the money. That night, at 10:07 p.m., Alex Murdaugh called 911 to report that both his wife and youngest son had been shot and killed at the family's hunting property in Islandton. The hunting property was located in a rural area where there were no witnesses. And to show you how cold-blooded Alex Murdaugh is, Chris Wilson at trial testified that he had spoken to Murdaugh on the night of the murders at 9:11 p.m., at 9:20 p.m., and 9:53 p.m., which was exactly the time that the killings were taking place. Wilson said the conversations were short and that nothing sounded out of the ordinary. The June 10th hearing that the Beach family called for was postponed, of course, and Murdaugh's own law firm decided to drop the issue of the millions of dollars he was suspected of stealing because, as they put it, they weren't about to harass him about money when they were worried about his mental state and the fact that his family had been killed. The double homicide of Murdaugh's wife and son would buy him some time, but it wouldn't last. September 3, 2021, Murdaugh's law firm again raised the issue of the missing millions of dollars. Murdaugh, rather than answer these accusations, instead decided to resign from the firm. According to Chris Wilson, Murdaugh confessed that he was an opioid addict and had been one for 20 years. He also admitted that he had been stealing money from the firm and its clients. Reports are that he had been spending as much as $50,000 a month on opioids. The very next day, Alex Murdaugh called 911 again, this time saying that he had been driving home when he stopped to inspect a flat tire, and that it was at that point someone had tried to shoot him dead. He sustained a non-fatal head wound. On September 14th, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED, said Murdaugh admitted he had tried to get a former client to kill him on September 4th, so his surviving son Richard could collect a $10 million insurance payment. On September 15th, lawyers for Gloria Satterfield's family filed suit against Murdaugh, claiming they had found that Murdaugh misappropriated the money that was supposed to go to the Satterfield family. SLED also announced they were opening a criminal investigation into her death. The next day, Alex Murdaugh was arrested and charged with fraud and conspiracy in the phony suicide scheme. And you can guess what happened next. The judge on the case immediately released him, though did ask him to surrender his passport. Alex checked himself into rehab, quote-unquote, but his freedom didn't last long. On October 14th, Murdaugh was arrested again at a Florida drug rehab center and charged with swindling millions from Gloria Satterfield's sons. Well, at least this time the judge actually denied him bond. December 13th, 2021, Murdaugh's attorney announced that he intended to confess judgment to stealing the Satterfield's heirs' settlement money and that he owed the family $4.3 million. This would be added to the $7.5 million that the Satterfield lawyers would recover from settlements with other parties they were suing in connection with Gloria's death. They said some of the money would go towards establishing a foundation in her name. July 14th, 2022, Alex Murdaugh was finally indicted by a grand jury on 2 counts of murder. Days later, he would be disbarred. January 26, 2023, Alex Murdaugh's trial finally begins. The witnesses were a who's who of his professional colleagues as well as people he had defrauded like the Satterfields. The prosecutors laid out the case that Murdaugh had committed the double murder as a way of getting attention off of himself for his financial crimes, and to postpone the legal actions that were pending against him from the Beach family. He wound up taking the stand in his defense, but it didn't help him. Last week, on March 2nd, the jury convicted him on both counts of murder. It took them less than 3 hours to come back with their verdict. Murdaugh reportedly plans to appeal the conviction, but he won't have much time for that since he's still facing another 99 criminal charges unrelated to the murders of his wife and son. So all this happened because this rich good old boy who came from money and power had a drug habit he was trying to feed. And not only did he possibly kill an old woman just to get money to sustain his habit, but his son was responsible for killing a young woman as well. Next time someone wants to lecture black people about law and order, just keep this case in mind. Opioids have been responsible for a huge number of deaths in the United States, to the point that it's actually one of the leading causes of death in the country. This is not just a drug problem, it is a plague. Opioid dealers have been killing people, opioid addicts have been killing people, and yet there's no Rockefeller laws, no mandatory sentencing guidelines, no 3 strikes specifically for this. Jim Crow Joe Biden hasn't proposed a single one of his anti-drug abuse acts like the ones that he was so eager to sponsor and sign back in the 80s and 90s. Because those laws were merely meant as a cover for a racist anti-black mass incarceration scheme. And we know this was the case because the opioid epidemic is far larger than the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s. And yet, none of the same white politicians who couldn't wait to enact draconian laws over crack want to do anything to punish the opioid dealers or the users. Instead, these same politicians break out the sad violins and tell us all that the answer isn't prison now. The answer is drug rehab programs. The white media's coverage of the opioid epidemic is conveniently sanitized. They don't focus on the rampant criminality of the opioid users or their dealers and distributors. The white media doesn't carpet bomb the public with stories about how these meth and opioid addicts steal from people, assault people, and kill people, and how the politicians need to lock them up, that the laws aren't tough enough. The streets are overrun by these violent opioid addicts and dealers running gun battles in the streets, people killing their family members because of this. And yet the white media is not pointing out the rampant criminality and the death toll and demanding that something be done about it as a criminal justice issue. They make sure not to do that. And the same thing goes for the movies and TV shows that you watch. It's an across-the-board effort that opioids are going to be a protected class of drug. But the white media is not racist, right? It just happened to work out that way, right? Here you have a man who committed at least 2 murders and quite possibly a third, 4 if you include Mallory Beach, and 5 if you include another young man who he's suspected of killing in a hit and run. So you've got a number of bodies connected to Alex Murdaugh. He's certainly a longtime drug addict and serial thief, and yet even with his decades-long addiction and other legal troubles, nobody seemed to think that it was too much of a problem until he finally got indicted. And as far as the boat accident and the hit and run, a lot of people who get all their news from the white media will be shocked that this guy was allowed to remain free after he had been involved or linked to so many fatalities. But if you follow the black media, especially if you watch my Friday crime reports, then you know that not only is this not unusual, this is actually the norm. And it's not only for rich and well-connected good old boys like Alex Murdaugh, but for everyone with genetic immunity from the law. This is why I do the Friday Crime Report, so you can see that this is not about money, because black defendants who have money are not allowed to have multiple dead bodies and committing fraud, and they are not released time and again. Go through the archives on this channel. This is why I go to such lengths to put together extensive timelines of these criminals' acts that I profile for you every Friday. I tell you about not only their crimes, but also their records, so that you can see that in all their cases, they were known to police in advance, and their crimes simply ignored, because there is a clear, open policy that there are people who the police and prosecutors aren't supposed to touch. And the immunity from law isn't based on your income, but based on skin color. Everyone else may be amazed by this case, but if you follow the black media, you know there's nothing extraordinary about it at all. Almost half a dozen dead bodies, one of them in his own home, millions in stolen money, and tons of drugs. Any one of those things would have gotten a black defendant locked up, and it wouldn't have taken 5 years and a national media feeding frenzy to get it done either. And while the white media may try to give a comforting postscript to this story as if finally this killer is done and dusted, the real question is, how many other Alex Murdaughs are there out there? Well, if you've been watching my crime reports, you already know the answer. A hell of a lot. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Valerie Blakely, Frederica Moore, Emily, Dario Anderson, and King Edwards. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.